The first thing wrong was that the guard at the vestibule door had turned his head a quarter of an inch, and in 11 years of running the Royal Night Line, I had never once seen one of them move. I was standing at the far end of the coupling platform between the 8th carriage and the 9th, a clipboard under my arm and a lantern hood half shut against the rain, when I saw it. We were stopped at Greywater Halt for the water take, the last stop before the long dark run north to the summer house, and the whole train sat hissing and ticking in the wet, 200 yards of varnished steel and gold leaf asleep on the rails. At the door of the King's carriage, the 9th, stood the man they had posted there for the journey, tall, motionless, the tall black fur of his bearskin beaded with rain, white gloves crossed at the small of his back, the lamp catching one row of medals and the long line of the rifle at his shoulder. A statue in red wool. I had walked past 100 such statues in my years on this line, and never thought of them as men at all, any more than I thought of the brass handrails as men. And this one had turned his head, not toward me, toward the join of the carriages, toward the dark steel throat where the 9th car hitched to the 10th, the rearmost car, the long one with the staff berths and the kitchen and the strong room. He was looking at the coupling. And then, as I watched, he turned it back, eyes forward, gloves still, and was a statue again. My name is Corwin Hale, and at that time I had been superintendent of the royal train of the realm of Marrowvale for 11 winters. I want that on the record, because this is the story of how I very nearly killed 40 people through nothing worse than confidence, and how a man I had never spoken to saved them by doing the one thing his whole life had trained him to do, which was nothing at all, beautifully, at exactly the right moment. I should have walked over to him at once. I did not. I told myself a guard looks where he likes, that the rain was in my eyes, that I had a water take to clear and a schedule the palace measured in seconds. So I clipped my lantern back to my belt and went forward to argue with the pump. But it saddened me, that quarter-inch. I have spent my life listening to a train the way a doctor listens to a chest, the knock of a flat wheel, the cough of a hot box, the particular sigh a brake makes when its shoe is worn 3 weeks past safe. I do not see the train. I hear it and I feel it through the soles of my boots. And the guard, who had no gauge and no manifest and no 11 years of timetable in his head, had felt something I had not. That was the thing that would not leave me. A man who knew nothing about my train had seen something about my train, and I had walked away to fight a water pump. The water came up slow that night, and while the column climbed I ran the journey in my mind, because that is what a superintendent does. He runs the journey. Greywater to the summit. The long bend at Coldharrow where the line swings out over the gorge on the old viaduct and the speed must come up not down to make the grade beyond. After Coldharrow the dark straight, no halt, no signal, no living soul for 30 miles. I had run that bend 1,000 times. I could feel it in my stomach now, the gentle press of it, the way the carriages leaned and sang. And a cold thought walked into me out of the rain and would not walk out again. If a coupling were to fail, if the pin between the 9th car and the 10th were to lift free, it would not fail at the halt, where the train was still. It would fail on the bend, where the cars pulled hardest against one another, and the long rear weight tried to fly straight off the curve. The 10th car, the heavy one, the staff and the kitchen and the strong room, would part from the train at the worst yard of the worst mile of the whole line, and go over the edge into the dark of the gorge, while the front 9 ran on into the night, not even knowing they had lost their tail. I told myself I was a fanciful man that night to make the thought go away. It did not go away. So I did the thing I should have done the moment I saw him move. I walked back along the wet platform to the join of the 9th and 10th carriages, and I looked at the coupling the guard had looked at. It was dark down in the throat between the cars, a tangle of black iron and dripping grease, the great hook and the screw and the safety pin that held the screw, all of it slick and ordinary. I crouched and put my lantern in close, and for a moment I saw nothing because there was nothing to see, nothing missing, nothing broken, nothing hanging loose. The hook was seated. The screw was home. The pin was through. Then I saw what was wrong, and the rain went very far away. The pin was through, but the split ends of it, the legs that a man bends apart with a pair of pliers so the pin can never, ever work itself free, were straight, closed up neat and straight, side by side the way they go in. Not bent, not splayed. Anyone glancing at that coupling, even a careful man, would see a pin in its hole and tick his box and move on. But a pin with its legs left straight is a pin that has been put in to be taken out. It is a pin that will ride home all day on a quiet line and then, on a hard bend, under the long pull and the shutter, walk itself up out of its hole 1/8 of an inch at a time until it is gone, and no one will ever find it, because it will be lying in a gorge under a wrecked carriage, looking exactly like a pin that shook loose by accident on a rough old road. I knelt in the grease in my good coat, and I could not breathe. Somebody had loosened that bolt on purpose. Somebody on my train, somebody who knew couplings, somebody who knew this line and that bend, had set the rear of the King's train to come off on the viaduct in the dark. And a silent man in a bearskin, who knew none of what I knew, had felt it standing 20 feet away and turned his head 1/4 of an inch and turned it back. I stood up. The rain had stopped. I could hear the pump shutting off, the long groan of the water valve closing, the conductor's whistle that meant we would be moving in 90 seconds. 90 seconds, and then the climb, and then Cold Haro, and the bend, and the gorge. And I realized I did not know who to tell. That sounds absurd. I was the superintendent. I had only to walk to the guard's van, pull the brake, and send for the line police. But the not knowing who to tell is the whole spine of this story. A pin's legs left straight is not proof. It is a thing a careless fitter might do on a slow night and a tired man might tick past. If I held the King's train on the open road at midnight, threw 40 staff into the rain, and summoned the police over a coupling that, examined in the lamplight by men who would much rather be in bed, looked perfectly seated, and if I were wrong, I would not be superintendent in the morning. That much I could have borne. What I could not yet see, and what made my stomach turn colder than the rain, was the other thing. Whoever had set that pin was on this train. He had walked that throat between the cars with his pliers in the dark at a halt, while 40 men he knew went about their work around him. He was one of mine, and if I raised the alarm clumsily, I would teach him only that I had seen, and give him the whole long climb to Cold Haro to put it right, or to find a second way to do the same thing, or simply to be ready. I needed to know who, before I let him know that I knew. So I did not pull the brake. God forgive me, I let the train roll. The whistle went. The couplings took up their slack with the long iron groan I knew like my own pulse, and 200 yards of the King's house slid out of Greywater Halt into the dark and began, gently, to climb. I stood in the swaying corridor of the 8th car with my heart going like a flat wheel and 40 minutes to the bend, and I made myself think. Who had been at the rear in the last hour? Who knew couplings? Who could walk that throat between the cars at a halt and draw no eye? There was only one honest answer, and it was the worst one. The man who oversaw the couplings, the brakes, the running gear of the whole rear half of the train, the man whose job it was, whose right it was, to be down in that greasy throat with a lantern at every halt, whom no one would look at twice if they found him there, was my own running foreman, Master Sefton Vane. 22 years on the Royal line. The man who had taught me which sigh a worn brake makes. The man whose hand I would have put in the fire before I doubted him. If a pin on the Royal train had been set to walk, there was not another soul aboard who could have set it and been invisible doing it. And there was not another soul aboard I would have less believed capable of it. I want to be honest about the next few minutes because they were not my finest. I argued with myself like a coward. Not Vane. Anyone but Vane, a fitter, a stranger, a boy with a grudge, let it be anyone but the man who had stood beside me at 1,000 water takes. I almost talked myself back into the comfortable idea that I had imagined the whole thing. I did not go to my berth. I went instead to the 9th car, the King's car, and I stood in its forward vestibule, and I looked through the glass of the connecting door at the back of the guard. He had his post at the rear door of the king's carriage, the door that gave onto the throat where the pin was. He stood as they stand, perfectly square, the train's long sway moving through him, so that he neither braced nor swayed but simply belonged to the motion the way a tree belongs to the wind. The lamp of the vestibule put a hard edge of light down one side of the bearskin and the red wool and lost the rest of him in shadow. I could not see his face. I did not need to. I had come to him for a reason I could not have named at the time and can name now. He was the only man on the train I was certain had not set the pin, because he was the only man on the train who had warned me of it. I went through the connecting door, into the rocking dark of the little vestibule, and I stood beside him. He did not look at me. Of course he did not. A guard on the king's door does not turn for a superintendent or for a storm or for the end of the world. But I am a railwayman, and I read men's stillness the way I read a train's, and I will tell you that his stillness changed when I came in. It did not soften, it sharpened. It became the stillness of a man who has been waiting, with enormous patience, for someone with the authority to act to finally come and stand where he had been trying, in the only language his office allowed him, to make someone stand. "You looked at the coupling," I said. I kept my voice under the noise of the wheels pitched for him alone. "At Greywater, you turned your head and you looked at the join of the 9th car and the 10th. Why?" For a long moment there was only the wheels, and the rain starting again on the roof, and the long lean of the first easy curve below Cold Hero taking us gently sideways and back. Then the guard spoke. He did not turn his head. His lips barely moved. His voice, when it came, was low and level, and carried under the wheel noise straight to me, and to no one else. The trained quiet of a man who has spent his life saying nothing in places where a word costs everything. "A man went into the throat at the second halt," he said, "and again at the third, and again at Greywater. The same man, 3 halts running with a lantern and a roll of tools. The first 2 times he came out wiping his hands. The last time, sir, he came out wiping his hands and he looked back at it. A man who has finished a job does not look back at it. A man who has set one does." I felt the cold go all the way down. "You know him," I said, "the man." "I do not know his name," said the guard, eyes forward, white gloves still at the small of his back. "It is not my place to know names, but I will know him again. And I think, sir, by the way you have come and stood here, that you already know it, and that you are hoping I will tell you you are wrong." I could not speak. "I cannot tell you you are wrong," the guard said quietly. "I can only tell you what I saw. I have thought in the years since about what it must cost a man to stand a whole journey at a door and watch a wrong being done at the very joint of the thing he is sworn to protect, and not be able to stop it. He could not leave his post. His post was the king's door. He could not raise his rifle at a foreman with a lantern over a hunch. A guard who points a weapon at an honest-looking man frightens the very quarry he means to catch into doing the deed faster. He had no whistle he was permitted to blow, no brake to pull, no name he was allowed to speak. He had exactly one tool, the smallest a man ever carried. He could turn his head a quarter of an inch at the one moment a man who understood trains might be looking. He had spent that tool on me, and I had nearly walked away from it. "What is your name?" I said. It was the only courtesy I had to give him. "Sergeant Aldous Reeve, sir," he said, "of the King's Watch." And before the King's Watch, Sergeant Reeve. Because I had heard something in him now, under the parade quiet, the way his eye had gone to the coupling and not, as a layman's would, to the door or the window. He had not learned to read a coupling at a palace gate. "Before the watch I was 11 years a sapper, sir," he said. "On the King's military railways. We laid line under fire and we took it up again behind us so it could not be used. A man learns couplings, sir, when his life and his column's life ride on a joint holding, and he learns, just as well, how to make a joint that will let go on its own, somewhere down the road with no hand near it. That is half of what a railway sapper is for." For the first time something moved in his voice that was almost grim. I have set a pin to walk, sir. More than once in the war on enemy line. I know exactly what I am looking at when I see one. That is why I turned my head. So that was the shape of it. Of all the men the palace might have posted at the king's door that night, they had posted the one man on the train who could read a sabotaged coupling on sight, and who was forbidden by every rule of his office from doing one thing about it but turn his head and wait for a man like me. I have never since believed entirely in luck. I call it the only piece of grace in a very dark night. Then help me, I said. I am the only man on this train who can stop it, and I cannot stop it yet. If I pull the brake on this grade, I tear the train apart at the very joint he has weakened, and do his work for him with my own hand. If I hold at the summit and send for police, I have nothing to show them but a pin with straight legs, and a foreman of 22 years who will say a tired fitter was careless, and that the superintendent has lost his nerve, and he will be believed, because I would have believed him myself an hour ago. I need to take that pin out of the equation quietly, without his knowing, before cold hero, and I need to catch him in such a way that even I cannot doubt it. Can it be done? Sergeant Reeve was silent for the length of one long curve. When he spoke, it was the calm, ordered voice of a man laying a charge. "Two things, sir, and they are separate," he said. "First, the train must be made safe. That is the coupling, and it must not wait on the catching of any man. Second, the man must be caught in a way that holds, and that is slower, and it must not be allowed to endanger the first. Never let the catching of the guilty cost you the saving of the innocent." He paused. "The coupling first. If a length of safety chain were shackled across the joint under the buffers and the pin's legs properly splayed, the coupling could not part even if the loosened pin walked clean out. The car would hold. The bend would be survived. And it could be done from below, by a man who knew couplings, in under 3 minutes, because a man crouched in the throat with a lantern is the most ordinary sight on a railway in the world." "There is no next halt before Cold Hero," I said. "Greywater was the last. That is the whole horror of it. He chose his bend because there is nothing and no one between here and there." "Then the train must be stopped," said Reeve. "Not on the bend and not by tearing it apart, but somewhere flat and slow and of your choosing, for a reason that wakes no suspicion in any man aboard, least of all in him. You are the superintendent. You command the train. What reason can you make for a halt on the open road that the running foreman himself would believe, that he would expect, that would even please him?" And I, who had argued with a water pump an hour ago and missed the warning of a saint, finally had a thought worthy of the night. "A hot box," I said slowly. "If I tell the driver I have a journal running hot on one of the rear trucks, a bearing about to seize, he will stop anywhere at once, because a seized bearing throws a car off the rails as surely as any sabotage, and every railwayman fears it more than fire. And the man I would send below to pack the box and cool it and pass it safe, the man whose duty it is, whom the driver and the crew would expect to see go down into the throat with a lantern and a roll of tools." I stopped. The cold turned over in me again, but cleaner now because I saw the trap forming. It is the running foreman. It is Vane himself. I would send Vane down to the very coupling he sabotaged, on an errand he cannot refuse. In front of witnesses I have placed with you, Sergeant, where you can see his hands." For the first time, Sergeant Aldous Reeve turned his head. He turned it the same quarter of an inch he had turned it at Greywater, and he looked at me full, and in the hard edge of the vestibule lamp I saw his face at last, an old soldier's face, seamed and still, with eyes that had watched a great deal of dark road and learned to give nothing back to it. And he did something I would not have thought that face could do. The corner of his mouth moved, the smallest fraction, the ghost of grim approval. "Yes, sir," he said, "that will do it. Send the foreman to mend the thing he broke. Let me be the eyes. And whatever you do, sir, when he is down in that throat with his lantern, do not let him be alone with it for 1/2 of 1 second. Because a man who set a pin to walk, finding himself ordered to the very joint with the superintendent watching, has only 2 roads. He can mend it and pretend he never harmed it, and we have lost him, but the train is safe, and I will count that a clean win. Or he will understand in that black throat that he has been found out. And then, sir, he will reach for the other way to do it. Reeves' eyes went forward again, and his voice dropped to almost nothing. There is always another way to part a train if a man is willing to die parting it. Be ready for that. I will be. I went forward to the engine. I will not pretend my legs were steady going up the swaying corridors, past the dark sleeping doors of the household, the dim gold of the dining car with its chairs strapped for the night. I passed 2 of my own men and gave them a good evening I did not feel, and I thought, which of you knows? And then, none of you, only Vane. I had run this train as a family for 11 years, and I had carved 1 man out of the family in the space of 1 hour, on the word of a coupling pin and a guard's quarter-inch, and I was about to wager 40 lives that I had carved out the right one. The driver was a steady soul named Brennan, gray at the temples, a man I trusted with the king's life every night of the year, because every night of the year I did. I leaned into the heat and the noise of the cab, and I told him the lie that was also, in every way that mattered, the truth. I had reason to fear a journal running hot on the rear truck of the 10th car. I wanted the train stopped on the long flat below Coldharrow before we took the grade, and I wanted it stopped gently, no snatch, no hard brake. Let her roll down to a stand like setting down a full glass. Brennan did not argue. A driver never argues a hot box. He only nodded and reached for the brake, and I felt the great train begin, smoothly to slow. "And Brennan," I said, "say nothing to the rear by bell or whistle beyond the stop. I'll send the foreman down myself. I want as few hands on it as may be." He gave me a look. It was an odd order, but a superintendent's odd order on the Royal line is still an order, and he nodded again and held his peace. Good men. I was surrounded that night by good men, which is exactly what makes one bad one so deadly. He hides in their goodness as in a crowd. We came down to a stand on the flat in the dark, in the rain, with the gorge still a mile and a half ahead, and the long bend a mile beyond that. The engine breathed. The carriages settled on their springs with the small sounds I knew, and I went back through the train to find Master Sefton Vane. He was already up. Of course he was. A running foreman feels a hot box stop in his sleep, the way I do. He met me in the corridor of the 7th car, pulling his coat on over his nightshirt, his face creased and concerned and entirely, perfectly ordinary, the broad, weathered, kindly face I had trusted for 11 years. And looking at it, I felt my whole theory wobble and nearly fall. This man, the man who would send the strong room and 8 sleeping stewards into a gorge. I could not make the 2 pictures lie on top of one another. "Where is she running hot, Mr. Hale?" he said, and his voice was all concern, all duty, and I hated for one moment the thing I was doing to a good man, until I remembered the straight legs of that pin, which no tired fitter splays shut, which a man closes only on purpose, and the picture steadied. "Rear truck of the 10th, I said. The driver felt her drag. "I want you down in the throat with a lantern, Sefton. Pack the box, cool the journal, and while you're under there, give the whole coupling a look for me. I had a fancy at Greywater the pin was sitting proud." I watched his face when I said it. I am not a clever man at faces, but I had been told to watch, and I watched, and I will swear to my last day that something went still behind his eyes for the smallest part of a second, not fear, nothing so loud, just a small private arithmetic, a man recalculating a sum he had thought already finished. Then it was gone, and he was all bluff concern again. "Sitting proud, was it?" he said. "Old line, rough road, I'll set it right. Don't you fret, Mr. Hale, I've nursed worse couplings than this one home." And he picked up his lantern and his roll of tools, the very roll, and turned for the rear, and I walked behind him, my heart a flat wheel knocking in my chest. The guard was at his post at the King's door as we came through the 9th car. He did not look at us. He did not look at Vane. He was a statue in red wool with the lamp on one cheek of the bearskin, gloves at the small of his back, the rifle a long quiet line at his shoulder, and you would have sworn on a stack of timetables that he had not the smallest interest in the foreman passing within a foot of him with a lantern and a roll of tools. But I knew now what to read, and as Vane passed him I saw the guard's weight come very slightly off his heels and onto the balls of his feet, the whole of him, without a hair of him appearing to move, going from stillness at rest to stillness. That is about to move. The way a held breath is different from an empty chest. He had read Vane in one pass, 3 halts of watching condensed into a single recognition. That is him, and he had made himself ready. We came to the rear vestibule, the throat, the join. Vane opened the lower hatch, and the cold, wet roar of the trackside came up at us, the smell of grease and wet iron and rain. He swung his lantern down into the black tangle and made to climb down into it alone. "I'll hold your lamp," I said, and got down into the throat beside him before he could refuse, my good coat in the grease again, and behind and above me soundless. The guard left the King's door for the first time in the whole journey and came to stand in the open rear doorway, filling it, the lamp at his back so that to Vane, looking up out of the pit, he would have been only a tall black shape against the light, but a shape with a rifle, and a shape that had moved. 3 of us then, in a space made for one, with the rain coming in and the gorge 1.5 miles ahead in the dark. Vane crouched to the coupling. His big hands went into the tangle, sure and easy, and I watched them the way I have never watched anything in my life. For a few seconds he did nothing but what an honest foreman does, felt the journal box, which was of course stone cold, there being no hot box and never having been one. He felt it cold, and he went very still, and I saw him understand the first piece of it. There is no hot box. He had been called down here on a lie. His hand moved to the pin. And in the wet lamplight, with my heart stopped in my chest and the guard a black shape filling the door above us, I watched Master Sefton Vane's fingers find the loosened pin in its hole, the pin with the straight legs, his own quiet work, and I watched them not splay it home to safety, as an innocent man's would, and not even draw it the rest of the way out to finish the sabotage, which he no longer dared with me a foot away. I watched his fingers move past the pin entirely, to the screw of the coupling itself, and begin, in the dark, where he thought only the dark could see, to back it off. This was the other way. This was the thing Reeve had warned me of. The walked pin had been the patient plan, the clean plan, the one that left no fingerprint and could be blamed on a rough old road. But the walked pin was slow, and Vane had just learned that he had been found out, that the hot box was a lie and the superintendent was crouched a foot away, and there would be no second halt, no second chance, that it was here or nowhere. So he had abandoned the patient plan and reached, exactly as the old sapper said he would, for the willing-to-be-caught plan. Opened the screw coupling now by hand in the dark, trusting that I, a man he had taught, a man who loved him, would not understand quickly enough what those sure honest hands were doing 6 inches from my face, until the slack ran out on the next pull, and the 10th car began gently to drift back and away from the train and toward the gorge. He nearly had it too, because he was right about one thing. I did not understand quickly enough. I saw his hands move, and my mind, still half in love with the good foreman, still said, packing the box, good man, even as the cold part of me screamed, there is no box. I lost a full second to my own trust. The guard did not lose the second. I did not see him decide. I have replayed it 10,000 times and I cannot find the decision in it. There was no gathering, no warning, no shout. There was the black shape filling the doorway, and then there was not, and then there was a white glove in the lamplight closing over Vane's 2 big hands where they worked the screw, closing over them and stopping them dead, with a strength that did not strain and did not shake, the way a vice stops a thing, the way the end of an argument stops it. Sergeant Aldous Reeve had come down off the rear sill into the throat without a sound, in the dark, on a moving man's blind side, and laid one gloved hand over the saboteur's hands and simply held them still against the iron. He did not strike Vane. He did not draw the rifle. There was no rifle in his hands at all. He had set it aside on the sill above, because a weapon in that black pit between two cars is a danger to everyone, and a man who has laid line under fire knows it. He used no more force than the work required, and not 1 ounce more. He held a man's hands away from a coupling. That was all. That was everything. "That will be enough now," said Reeve, in the low-level parade quiet I had first heard at the king's door, a voice with no anger in it and no triumph, only a great and final steadiness. "Take your hands off the king's train." For 1 long second Vane heaved against the glove. I felt the whole throat fill with the silent animal effort of it. A strong man of 22 years on the line, straining every cord he had to free his hands for 6 more seconds of work. And the glove did not move. The arm behind it did not move. Reeve held him the way the viaduct holds the line, without seeming to do anything at all, and Vane's strength broke against it and ran out of him, and his hands went slack, and his shoulders came down, and the fight left the throat as the rain came down on the 3 of us. "Hold the lamp up, Mr. Hale," said Reeve quietly, never taking his eyes or his glove off Vane. "Up high where you can see. Now look at the screw. Tell me, as the man who knows this train, is it backed off or is it home?" I lifted the lamp in a hand that shook, and I looked. The screw was backed off 4 full turns. 4 turns more and the slack would have run out of the coupling, and the cars would have begun to part on the very next rise of the grade. I have measured my whole life in seconds on this line, and I will tell you that we were inside a minute of it. Less. "Backed off," I said. My voice did not sound like mine. 4 turns, he was taking it apart. "Then we will put it back together," said Reeve. "And we will do that first, before we do anything to this man, because the train is more important than the man, and the king asleep behind that door is more important than my pride or yours or his guilt. Mr. Hale, drive the screw home all the way hard, then back a quarter for the spring. Splay the legs of that walked pin properly while you are down there, and there is a length of safety chain shackled under the left buffer. Pass it across the join and pin it. We will not leave this throat until this coupling cannot part if the whole world stands on it. Can you do that?" I could. With Reeve's glove still locked over Vane's hands and Vane gone limp and silent against the iron, I drove the screw home until my arms burned, and I splayed the legs of that wicked little pin wide with the foreman's own pliers, and I shackled the chain across the join and pinned it and tugged it again. By the time I was done, my good coat was ruined past saving, and my hands were black to the wrist, and I was weeping, I think, though in the rain a man cannot tell. But the 10th car was bound to the 9th car with a screw home, a pin splayed, and a chain across, 3 holds where there should be 1, and it would have taken the gorge itself to part them. "Now," said Reeve, "now we may attend to the man." We brought Master Sefton Vane up out of the throat into the rear vestibule, and Reeve held him without unkindness, while I roused 2 of my soundest men and set them to watch the doors. Vane did not run. There was nowhere on a stopped train to run, and besides, the fight had gone clean out of him in the throat, the way it does out of a man who has built a thing in the dark for months, and seen it taken apart in a minute by a hand he never heard coming. He sat on the vestibule bench with his ruined plan and his lantern guttering beside him, and after a while he talked, because men who have carried a thing that heavy mostly want, in the end, to set it down. I will not lay out all of it here. The courts did that later, and it was both smaller and sadder than the size of the crime. There were debts, and men he owed who were not patient, men who had promised that a single accident on the Royal line, a coupling that shook loose on a rough old viaduct, a tragedy with no fingerprints, would clear his ledger and let him keep the only life he had ever known. He had told himself the king would not be in the rear car. He had told himself the 8 stewards were a number he need not look at. He had told himself, 22 years a railwayman, that he would feel it if it were truly wrong, and he had not let himself feel it. And that is the whole of how a good man does a monstrous thing, one comfortable lie at a time, told in the dark, where he believes only the dark can see. But the dark was not empty. That is the thing I have carried out of that night and will carry to my own. There was a man in the dark who had been trained his whole life to see in it and to say nothing of what he saw, and to want nothing for the seeing, and to wait endlessly, without reward, at a door that was not his to leave for the one moment when his seeing might be of use. Vane had counted on the dark. He had not counted on Sergeant Aldous Reeve. We did not run for the summit. I would not take the train onto that viaduct in the dark on any man's word that it was safe, not even my own. I held her on the flat till first light and sent a man back along the line to wire for the police. The household slept the whole of it, the king included, and that too is the guard's work, that the people he keeps are not even frightened, do not even wake, because a man stood between them and the gorge and gave the night nothing to show them. The police came up with the gray light. Vane went down the line with them quietly and looked back once at the train as it stood whole on the flat. The way a man looks back at a thing he has set, except that this time the thing had held, and there was nothing in his looking but the end of him. I crossed the viaduct that morning at walking pace with my heart in my mouth and the inspectors hanging out over the buffers, and the coupling held as if it had been forged whole, and the long bend at Coldharrow leaned us out over the bright gorge and sang us round and let us go, the way it had 1,000 times, the way it would 1,000 more. When I went back through the train to the 9th car, Sergeant Reeve was at the King's door again. He had cleaned the grease from his white gloves. I do not know how. A guard always does. He stood square and still with the morning on the bearskin and the rifle a long, quiet line at his shoulder, and he gave no sign at all that he had ever moved in his life, that he had ever come down off a sill in the dark and held a man's 2 hands away from 40 graves with 1 glove. He was a statue in red wool. The household would walk past him all the way home and see a statue, as I had once seen a statue, and never know. I stopped in front of him against every rule, and I did the only thing I could think to do. I straightened my ruined coat and I came to attention, 11 Winters Superintendent of the Royal Train, and I saluted him, clumsily I am sure, a railwayman's salute, but the best in me. He did not return it. He could not. His hands were where they belonged, at the small of his back, his eyes were forward. His post was the King's door and the King was waking behind it. But his weight came very slightly off his heels and onto the balls of his feet and back again. The smallest motion a man can make, the one he had spent on me at Greywater, and I understood that he had seen the salute, and accepted it, and given me in return the only thing his office allowed, the knowledge that he had seen. I have hired many men since on the strength of what they will do when something is wrong. But I value more highly now the rarer thing. The man who can be trusted with what he must not do, who can stand at a door and watch a wrong worked at the very joint of everything he loves, and not break his post, and not raise his hand, and not say a word, and spend his whole vigilance on 1/4-inch turn of the head at the one moment it can save us all. The world is kept, I have come to think, less by the men who act than by the men who can wait, who hold still in the dark while the slack runs out, and move only once and only enough, and never for themselves. We were 11 years on that line together after, and never spoke of it again. We did not need to. Every night when the couplings took up their slack with the long iron groan I know like my own pulse, I knew the joint was sound, because somewhere down the train a man I trusted with all our lives was standing in the dark, perfectly still, watching the throat, and I had learned at last to listen to him.